All right, everybody, welcome to the 2:15 discussion slot. This is a panel discussion on going beyond just general accessibility guidelines and how we can create, why we should want to create usable systems for people with disabilities. This is not going to be so much a how-to, but a why we should consider this as we're designing systems. My name is David Shepley. I'm a development specialist strategist at Designhammer, which is a design development and strategy firm for web-based projects located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Joined today by Kim Casey and John Samuel from Ablr, which is an Inclusion for All company that we will talk about a little bit more in a minute. But today, you can see the main session goals on the screen there. And as you guys have questions as they come up, please drop them in the Q&A. As they're relevant, we will discuss those within the panel. Others we can get to at the end. And if we run out of time, we invite you guys to join us in our co-sponsored booth, which is, if you are on the Expo tab, and scroll about 3/4 of the way down. So today we want to talk about how we specifically address the user experience within our Drupal systems for those folks who use assistive technology to navigate our sites. Oftentimes, we create systems that meet standards, that meet the WCAG standards, or whatever your likely governmental department or organizational standards are, but that doesn't necessarily make it usable. You know, we design and we build those systems with accessibility in mind. We run them through our automated testing software, and they pass the tests, and we say, you know, job well done. But that's not really the end of the road, because that doesn't necessarily help create a system that's fully usable and inclusive. As we've seen, if you guys were in the early part of the session here, you know, John and I have done this panel a couple times now using the Hopin platform, and it's been a challenge for somebody who needs to use a screen reader. So we'll get into more of that in a little bit. But today we're going to learn, you know, firsthand from these experts about the challenges around accessibility and as it relates to designing our systems, and why considering usability along with accessibility is so important. So our three panel members: David Minton is a founding partner at Designhammer, the company that I work at. Again, we're a digital agency in the Triangle, and David manages the day-to-day operations. Designhammer this year is celebrating 20 years in business, which, as you Drupal folks know, takes us back quite a long way in the Drupal world. We started developing around the 4 or 5 timestamp. So we've, you know, gone through a lot of different iterations of Drupal, and have really seen how that has grown, especially as it relates to accessibility over the years. David, over those 20 years, has spent a lot of time talking about strategic planning, usability, and web accessibility, especially as it relates to Drupal. And since 2010, he's actually talked a lot about web accessibility at national and regional conferences, including several Drupal camps, this very Drupal GovCon, the Digital Summit series, PHP World, and other regional conferences. John Samuel, who should be on your bottom right, is the founder, CEO, and chief architect of Ablr, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a disability inclusion and accessibility company, also based in RTP, just down the street from us. We are friendly neighbors here. The mission of Ablr is to eliminate the barriers that have excluded people with disabilities from many aspects of life, but specifically the web experience. John is the champion at Ablr for removing those barriers from folks, and his passion is very personal. As we discussed, he is blind, uses a screen reader. He's going to tell us a little bit about his most interesting journey. And his passion is to make sure the obstacles that he has faced over his journey are removed for others. And then finally, John's on the board of directors for the Aravind Eye Foundation, which is the world's largest eye care provider, and so speaks a lot locally, as is kind of regionally known for his work in diversity and inclusion and accessibility. Has also spoken on a number of national platforms. Then finally, Kim Casey is the Accessibility Operations Manager at Abler. Kim is cited like David and myself, and she leads the testing and certification effort for clients. She works hand in hand with other folks with visual disabilities who use various systems, from screen readers to others that we'll talk about down the road here. She has a very prestigious trusted tester certification, which comes from the Department of Homeland Security. So she is at the top of her game on that. And before joining Abler, she spent almost 20 years with the Sendero Group, which is a company dedicated to finding accessible solutions for independent wayfinding. When she was there, she authored and participated in over $4 million worth of federally funded grants for the development of those wayfinding tools. So those are the folks that we are going to be talking to today. Before we really get into some Q&A, I know that David wants to share his story of kind of how he started down his accessibility journey, and then how he and John came to meet each other. And then we can get into John's experience with going from being sighted to unsighted to now slightly less unsighted. And then we'll have some time for really navigating, talking about how we all navigate the world of considering accessibility in our work in Drupal and other web projects.
All right, it's my turn.
Yep.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody coming out to listen to us. We're sorry that we can't all be in person at the NIH. That was always one of the high points of our year at Design Hammer, was going out to GovCon and getting to really participate firsthand, but we'll do the best we can. So I wanted to sort of share the journey that I followed to be here and assemble this panel for you. So a little bit about me. My entry into the web development industry was way back around 1995. I started as an HTML coder, which I don't think is a job that exists anymore. Back then, that was before we were really using content management systems, and I would just sort of build HTML files every day. I was using BBEdit. Don't know if anyone still uses that, but any company whose slogan is "It doesn't suck, can't be all bad." This was back even before the visual editors like Dreamweaver, so we were just hand coding everything. And I tried to do some good code. I was always running syntax checkers, and I was happy to get my no errors message so I could check the box that I had passed my syntax check. One day I came across an accessibility checker, and I thought, great, this is another way I can make better code. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite as easy. Rather than simple pass or fail, I would just get a whole bunch of sort of conditional passes, conditional fails, but eventually I figured it all out, and I did my best to create accessible code. And but I never really thought about what that meant to end users, but just saw that as another checkbox for me to check off in addition to my syntax checking. Years later, I was now no longer writing code, but was now leading teams of designers and developers, and we're now building content management systems like Drupal. And now, unlike just straight HTML, trying to ensure that we were doing accessible code and accessible systems was far more difficult. There was a lot of time, not just for us, but also now that our clients were going to be adding and editing, modifying code, they also had to be aware of accessibility standards in order to make accessible and maintain accessible systems. So we'd always ask our clients if they wanted an accessible website, since this was going to impact design choices, functionality, and even just their content entry. Most typically, the response was, not unless we have to. Those that were interested or had to do it due to regulations or requirements always balked at the cost and the extra effort that would be necessary, both for our team and for their team. It was very unusual for us to get any clients that would just voluntarily authorize building an accessible system unless they had to. So after a lot of frustration about 2010, I started to evangelize about web accessibility in the hope of getting some people to agree to voluntarily build accessible sites. I spoke at conferences, I started writing articles, and I was hoping I could win somebody over so we could start checking off that accessibility compliance box on projects. But the question is, was that really the right message for everybody? And I learned when I met John back in 2019, and it was a real eye-opening experience for me in many ways. I finally saw the light and understood the difference that usable accessible systems actually made to end users. And I was also really embarrassed at how many site-based phrases I used, and it was very awkward. And I was determined to remember not to say "see you later" whenever John and I parted ways after a meeting. I learned from John that meeting accessibility requirements such as WCAG is really just the start and not the end goal. It should have been obvious to me, but from my experience over the last couple of years working with John and Abler, it seems that I wasn't the only one who really didn't understand this. So just because a site meets accessibility requirements doesn't make it usable for people with disabilities. And I've had firsthand experience working with John trying to use systems like Hopin, the frustration that he runs into. We all know that code that syntax checks and functions doesn't necessarily provide a positive user experience, and code that passes an accessibility checker doesn't necessarily provide a positive user experience either. We may just be leaving our users frustrated. So just checking the accessibility compliance box isn't enough. So what I'm really hoping is that the web development community can come together and do better and then start to incorporate native assistive technology users as part of the user interface and user experience testing process. So after attending this panel, I hope you can gain empathy for the struggles that people with disabilities face and start to channel that into compassion, because compassion is empathy plus the motivation to make a difference.
Thanks, David. So John, you were, like I mentioned, sighted and then lost your vision. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and what it was like? I guess that was probably the early days of navigating the web back then, so it was a little bit different, but then also, you know, your experience since then and how you've grown to champion this.
No, thank you, Dave, and thank you, David, for those kind words. And you know, it's always, you know, we've known each other for a few years now, and it's always touching to hear that. And I thank you for those kind words and just being my ally and my friend. Yeah, so I'm originally born and raised in North Carolina, and you know, when I started using the web, but yeah, 1993, 94, and you know, those times, you know, my site I was able to see, and I was able to get on no problem. But it was around as I was getting later in high school, around 1998, 1999, I really was struggling at that time to see what was going on the computer screen, and so when I went up to college, I knew something was off in my eyes. I was bumping into things, and just overall life was getting challenging for me. And when I got checked out, I was diagnosed with a degenerating eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa, and I was told I was going blind and that there was no hope for a cure. And as a young person, it was devastating. And the first things that went through my mind were, what girl wants to be with a guy who can't see? And then I was like, what job can I have if I'm blind? And then I was like, where can I live if I can't drive? And these kind of things just constantly consume me. And eventually, my actions led to me failing out of college. And I moved back home to my buddies in North Carolina, went to NC State University. And but I was ashamed and embarrassed to tell people what was going on with me. And so that experience, you know, that embarrassment to tell people was like the first sign. But I happened to be working at a Wachovia Bank, which was a bank as a teller, and we had this old DOS-based system. It was like white text on a black background, and that I could see. That was very good for me. And then, so what I started doing when I was working was actually whatever documents I had, I started inverting the colors, and that was the first kind of workaround I started figuring it out. And then after a little while, that just wasn't enough. And I found this little Microsoft magnifying mouse. And those two items together now were allowing me to navigate the web and use my computer. But a lot of the times, because of that inverted color screens, I wasn't able to see certain things. And but I still didn't know what accessibility was. I was figuring out my own accommodations. Soon, I think it was 2010, I got my first iPad, and I think that was the first time I saw the word accessibility in the and maybe a little bit later in the iPad versions, but that was the first time I saw the word accessibility in the settings for me to be able to invert the colors and so forth. But it really came down to, it was 2017, and I had just lost my job. I was living in DC. My wife and I had just built a house in Washington, DC, and we just had a baby. And for those of you in DC, that's not cheap. And now my site had hit a point to I can no longer use those two pieces, the inverted colors and magnification. They no longer help me. And I thought my career was over. And that's around the time I read this article about this software that was developed at this company called SAS, which is a data science company. And they designed this accessible software to help people who are blind and low vision visualize graphs and charts using sounds. And I thought it was super cool. But what was really cool was the guy who designed it, he had the same eye condition as me and lived in my hometown of Cary, North Carolina. And up until this point, in 17 years, I had never met another blind person. And I tried for months to get in touch with him, and without any luck. And then finally, my wife said, if he can live in North Carolina, maybe we can too. And so we found this house online, and we told my folks, and they got so excited. They never thought I was coming home. My dad immediately jumped in the car to go look at this house. And as he's driving, he's talking to us on the phone, and he started yelling at something. I'm like, what are you doing, Dad? And he's like, oh, there's a blind guy on the road. Maybe it's the guy you're trying to get in touch with. I was like, oh, Dad, please don't yell at blind people on the road. Don't yell at anyone on the road. And he's like, all right, gets out of the car and walks over to this poor guy on the road and says, are you Ed Summers? And the guy says, yes, I am. And my dad puts the phone in this poor guy ear and says, my son's trying to reach you. And after apologizing to him profusely, he agreed to meet me. And I came down that next weekend. And meeting Ed introduced me to the world of accessibility. He became a friend, a mentor, but he showed me that accessibility would allow me to enable me to keep my career. And my dreams of being an executive weren't over. And then he introduced me to an organization called LCI, which happens to be the largest employer of Americans who are blind, and is based right here in Durham, North Carolina, in RTP. And I came to the company with the task of creating a new business focused on creating upper mobility and in technology service jobs. And when I started thinking about what we had to do this, the first thing that I knew based on my own lived experiences was that we had to address the accessibility issue. And that's what we did. And we launched this new business. And this business really was a focus around removing the actual barriers, not just checking off the checkbox, but actually removing that barrier so that people could actually use software to be able to do jobs. And as you mentioned, Dave, working for LCI, one of the best things was that LCI is a nonprofit, but they are a nonprofit that makes money, and they fund organizations that are fighting blindness. And one organization they did fund was the Duke Eye Hospital. And as a result of the funding that LCI had provided, they had a retinist specialist and geneticist specialist, and he actually specialized in my very specific gene mutation. And he's one of very few doctors in the world. And again, he came to North Carolina at the same time I came back home, and he had a treatment for me. And as a result, he was able to give me back some sight. And now I'm able to see. I was able to see my kids' faces for the first time just this January. But the interesting thing is, even though I have some sight now, I still rely on the user experience that I learned as a person who is blind, because that's just so much more efficient and effective for me. And so hopefully that we'll go into a little bit more details about these things. But it really does. Me learning about accessibility and how to be a blind person using a screen reader, it changed my life. And even though we had a hard time today to get on to Hopin, last time we were on a meeting together doing this, I was 15 minutes late, and this time I was 4 minutes early. So I guess that's a win.
Yep. Yeah, and the company that, as John mentioned, that Abler spun out of, LCI actually provides a ton of manufacturing products for government organizations. I'm sure that many of you work for on the technical side, but they provide them on the supply side. So that's kind of it's a neat thing that we have right here in our neck of the woods. So Kim, your experience obviously is one who is sighted but works in intimately every day with folks who need to use adaptive technologies. Like, what have you seen as you use a screen reader, like the difference between your experience as a native user and then your experience when you use some of these adaptive technologies?
So I started off not really knowing anything about the blindness industry, probably similar to John's experience. And, over the years, seeing assistive technology and the creative ways that you can present information to people, and it makes it easier for everybody. So it's not just for people with disabilities. It's, if you make your interface better for accessibility, it's by default going to be better for everybody who's looking at your website. But there's so many times where, I can visually look at a website and think, wow, this looks really great, and read it with a screen reader, and most of it's, inaccessible, or it's out of order, or, of course, those automated checkers that we talked about early on, they can't tell you those sorts of things. And so you may have a website that's, checks the box of accessibility, but when somebody actually goes to use it, then you can't even read it. You don't even know what's going on and what's where, or what's important even, what the main idea of your website is. So, I think it's that, and I think another misconception is that if you go to design for accessibility, that you maybe, I don't know if we have anybody who's really strict on design and sort of marketing, branding sort of stuff. But if we do, a lot of people think that, hey, if I do accessibility, maybe I'll have to, decrease how cool my website looks. And that's not the case either. So we can have totally dynamic, really neat looking websites and also have them be accessible. So it's not an either or, it's a with kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. Sorry, I'm having my own computer issues here, touching a keyboard that I shouldn't touch. So John, how did you and Kim come in contact with each other, and how do you guys, I know that you are less involved in the day-to-day now, and you have a full staff that you empower and enable. How did your journeys cross, and how have you seen spinning up a whole department that really majors in and focuses on helping validate sites for folks? How's that synergy kind of worked with you two?
Yeah, no, it's interesting how, because Kim and I, we were working on two different sides of a joint partnership. LCI had funded a workforce innovation center in Kansas, in Wichita, Kansas. And Kim was working with the gentleman, the executive director. His name was Mike May, who was the founder of Sendero Group. And it was Kim and I started working there together. And I think Kim talked about it. For 20 years, she was working on accessible wayfinding, and she had been working with this gentleman, Mike May, for 20 years, who was blind. And she could empathize with everything I was going through. She had compassion for the mission, and so our team initially, when we built the first iteration of Abler, before it was Abler, it was called LCI Tech. We actually employed people who were all blind on the team. That's my mission. I was like, I got to create employment for people who are blind. I'm hiring people who are blind. Let's do this. And we had a whole team of blind people. And so now we're doing accessibility testing, and we were doing a presentation. We're like, oh man, we got a great service, and we were doing a presentation. And I think, David, I don't know if you were there, but we were doing this presentation, and everyone's like, oh, wow, that's great. You guys are doing this. And then somebody asked a question. He goes, oh, what's that pink banner that's across the screen? And all the blind people, we all kind of just, without knowing where we are, we just started looking at each other without looking at each other. And we realized, like, oh, crap, we need eyes. Because we just totally missed this fundamental piece. And that's why I was like, Kim.
I'm the eyes. I'm the eyes.
Kim, come on over. We need you.
Yeah, little did I know. I started off just being the eyes, and now it's the whole, like, once you're immersed, it's everything. So sometimes I'll find myself on websites and I'll load the screen reader just because there's nothing visual on the screen, but I know the button has to be somewhere, and I know the screen reader will pick it up. So yeah, it's really crazy. And John, there was a question in the Q&A about building empathy towards accessibility and really getting people to understand why it's important. And David gave a great answer, which is exactly what I was going to give. But it's actually seeing somebody with a disability trying to access the resource that you are providing. And, we do that at Abler. Many times we'll just create videos of people maybe trying to order a product or access the contact us form. And people will see, oh my gosh, I had no idea I was causing so much trouble in my interface. It's a 40-minute process for somebody with a screen reader to fill out my contact form. And that's probably the most eye-opening thing that anyone could see about their own website if they're needing convincing on why this is important.
Yeah, I think for me, the first time that I met John, we were visiting them in their office, and I mean, to be honest, the way that John has learned and adapted, I didn't realize until we were probably a quarter of the way through the tour that John actually had visual impairments, because he knew where he was going. We were walking through a factory with things that I think I would trip over because I'm clumsy, and didn't kind of realize that he had this visual impairment. Then we sat down in a conference room, and one of his testers, showed us how to use a screen reader. And talk about adapting to adaptive technologies. Like, she was able to scroll and listen to what a website is telling you about accessibility at probably 20x speed. I mean, it was some speed where I couldn't even understand what was coming at it, but she understood fully what was happening there. So how does that change the way? I mean, there's got to be a way that you learn to still appreciate the web and the functions of the web, but how does that change that interactivity for you, John? And then Kim, as you're making recommendations and remediation, it's like, how much are you thinking about, like, this is how somebody's experiencing this? They're not looking at pretty pictures, and they're not looking at easy buttons to click.
Yeah, no, I'll even talk about just our own experience, just on Hopin right now, right? For instance, we listen. You talked about how we listen at screen readers so fast. I joke and say that's the speed of business, that we have to, because as fast as you can, visualize a screen, you can look, you kind of do your Z scanning. We have to listen to as much content as possible. And so, for instance, as we're going through, I had to quickly listen to all the little buttons, every feature of all the elements that are tagged, linked. And so I was going through everything. And then finally, Kim was talking about there should be a blue button that says allow, share video and audio, but that's not popping up. I can't see it. But as I was going through, they had participant information. Then there was another tab that said more info. And at random, I just clicked more info, and that's where it was. That's where I then found this share audio and video. But that user experience for a screen reader, that was not intuitive for me. And when we think about the kind of fundamentals of WCAG, the WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, it needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And that perceivable piece is, I need to be able to use one of my senses to do it. Operate it, it should be, I should be able to operate and do what the functionality of that site is. But the U piece, that understandable, I should understand that this is a logical flow of me doing it, but that wasn't there, right? I think that's where the accessibility functionality of the of Hopin actually fails, is that I did not understand how I could actually operate it, because it wasn't intuitive to me. And I think that me learning how to use the tools, we have, as a user, we have to listen to so much stuff all the time, that because the easiest route is not usually the route that it is designed for, or that is set up for somebody with an assistive technology. But from a visual perspective, it is, I think.
So, John, I remember you were talking to me about our last Hopin experience, and something that hadn't even occurred to me was we were in session when you were trying to join our session, and the problem is you were trying to hear your screen reader while we were talking over it, and there was no way to independently mute the audio of the session so you
That's
could
correct.
actually listen to your screen reader provide feedback on what was going on.
Yeah.
And that must be incredibly frustrating, and something I can't understand why it hasn't really occurred to people, because there's many systems that are, you know, if you were in the keynote and you're trying to leave the keynote, how do you find the link to leave the keynote while the keynote's running?
Yeah, you're right. But that's why I have to say thank you to both y'all. I could hear y'all in there, and then you guys were quiet for me. So thank you for that. So,
Well, I think
That wasn't intentional.
yeah, we just ran out of things to say, John. I think the other thing that came up last time, David and John, was how John had to call on the help of a complete stranger to access his computer. And this happens, you know, if you're thinking about doing a product purchase or doing banking, and you can't access the information yourself. As a blind person, you have to give permission to somebody else to have all of your private information, and that's a huge security issue, that you can't process these things if it's not set up correctly.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, we talk so much about cybersecurity and security, but we need to be thinking that accessibility is security as well, and that's why it's so important. Because I mean, it's so funny. We do all of these cybersecurity trainings, and they say don't give your password to anyone, but you know, or don't let people see this. But in many cases, for people with accessibility requirements, we have to, and that's a major issue.
Yeah,
right.
And then David, we spend a lot of time, you know, selling and producing Drupal projects. We do upwards of 5 to 10 new builds a year, and then 15 or so sites that we continuously work on, maybe more than that. I think part of Elizabeth's question was stakeholders who don't understand why we need to put time, effort, and resources into ensuring accessibility. When we get a project, we typically, in the early engagement of a project, will ask a client what their accessibility requirements are, but then further what they would like their usability of that to be. And I think, to Elizabeth's point, a lot of times people say they care about it until you put a price tag on it. What are some of the ways that you would talk to a Drupal, either just a developer or somebody within their organization who might have some influence on, you know, why it's important not just to check off those boxes, and how, you know, they as a developer can kind of go beyond that a little bit?
I think my favorite example of that is, I mentioned it shortly earlier, is that when you fix accessibility issues, you're almost guaranteeing that all usability issues are solved all at once. So I know many times when we're doing accessibility audits, I will find code-based errors, and I will find things like buttons that don't activate, or calendars that don't expand. And it's, you know, I'll find it because of accessibility reasons, but really it's everyone on that website accessing that website having the same experience, but nobody calls it out. So it's, you know, it's really just a really in-depth comb through every website to make sure that everything's usable.
Another thing is, in addition to usability, accessibility will also lead to better SEO performance. And it's funny, when I first started evangelizing over 10 years ago, that was sort of what I was pitching, is usability, accessibility, and SEO are really three forms of the same thing. It's just
right.
which group are you trying to appeal to? Are you appealing to you know, non-disabled users, or users with disabilities, or search engine robots? So essentially, accessibility wants good structure and good identification and good labels, and that's exactly what the search engine robot and the indexing software and the algorithms want, because they need help trying to associate data together. And that's exactly what someone using a screen reader also needs, or someone who's using keyboard navigation, who needs to be able to interface the navigation and the links easily.
Yeah.
And John, so in the you know, in the poll that David put out there, of the 5 questions, a whole 17% of folks were in the, I know that our site is actually usable and not just accessible by people with disabilities. Most of the other folks were, I hope so, I'm not sure, and I doubt it. You know, and these are that's obviously an issue of concern there. And like what, especially in government where budgets are tight, there's not necessarily unlimited dollars to spend, but also, there is to a degree a level of empathy that a government organization should have. What are some pieces of advice that you would give for just education on how do we get to that? How do we get beyond the I don't even know or I doubt it?
Well, what's most shocking is the 70% who know that it's usable. That's pretty amazing. Like, wow, that's an amazing number right there. But one of the things that I often the case, people will in many usability testing, they'll just grab random people who are walking on the street or available on a Monday afternoon at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And when I start thinking about that, there may be a reason why that person's available at 1 or 2 in the afternoon, because that person may not have a job, or person may not be, they got nothing else going on, right? And so when I start thinking about it, that's what we really need to be thinking about, is actual professionals with disabilities to be doing testing, because that's often the case of you have to think about who is your actual persona that you're looking for. And so there's a lot of organizations out there like LCI, or there's 96 national industries for the blind agencies across the country. And these organizations and others will be able to provide you with professionals with disabilities, even just asking them today, hey, can you please help check it out? But again, one thing that I do want to urge and request people is that when you do use people with disabilities as usability testers and so forth, it is important to pay individuals, because that's something that's overlooked too often. They take people for disabilities for granted and don't include them. But I think it's really important to make sure that the people are being compensated for their time. But I think it provides a really good opportunity to engage the community that you're trying to serve, right? Engage those individuals. And I think once you do, then people's word of mouth in the disability community, it will spread like fire, and they will share and say, look, this organization, this agency is doing a good job. They will talk about it, and they will let other people know.
Yeah, something else. I was going to say something else I learned from John, as far as another reason it's important, is a lot of organizations and businesses are now saying they want to be diverse and they want to be inclusive, but if somebody with a disability is considering working for your organization and the first thing they do is go to your website and it's not accessible to them, what does that tell them about how they're going to be treated at that job? And John told me something else that was even more important, was so many online job application systems he's encountered are not accessible. So even if somebody does want to apply for a job, it may take them literally hours to fill out the application form that another person might only take a few minutes on.
That's right, John. Do you remember that exercise? That was when I first started on with LCI Tech Enabler. We did, just a sample of, what was it, 20 some?
Yeah, the top
websites?
20 employers in North Carolina.
That's
right.
I said,
I want to say, if you're truly the top 20 employers, let's make sure.
How well can I get a job here?
Exactly.
Nice. Yeah, and I know, a couple of weeks ago we did this panel with a bunch of UX UI designers. This panel is very much, I think, more focused around Drupal developers, folks passionate in the Drupal community. So just to briefly get into like technical implementation, what are some small things that folks could do? I know that like we were talking about things that frustrate us as sighted users that you've had difficulties with, like, the CAPTCHA, for example. Like John, you wouldn't know this, but like, it'll ask you to, check all the stoplights. And I'm like, I did check all the stoplights, daggone it. And, I've missed one somehow. Or, the cookies notifications that come up, or pop-up emails. I was working with a client just last week, and they essentially want a pop-up email for subscriptions to different listservs on like every other page on their site. Things like that. Are there ways, knowing those are major barriers, that folks could think about more intelligently coding those or just making them more accessible.
Yeah, Kim, do you have something right here? And I'll go after you.
I think, yeah, the main thing is creating a good structure. I think David mentioned that on the SEO, making sure that everything is logical in how it's laid out. Providing labels for form fields. Yeah, I mean, John, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to even say, the pop-ups, like even as we saw, just like we were talking about as you talk about capture right now, right? Even registering for this event, the number of the pop-ups that were coming up that I just couldn't see, and that I had to do this with Kim there. And I think that when we watching me, Kim I'd have to share my screen with Kim as I was registering for this event. And I think that goes back to just making sure that everything is understandable, coding it in the sense that using similar layouts, templates as much as you can, that people can then you understand you can predict what this layout is going to be. I know what the call to action is going to be, and if you lay out your sites and pages that way, that makes it much easier. Because I think we're focusing here a lot on people with visual impairments, but having a predictable, intuitive layout will not only help people who are blind, but it'll also help people with cognitive disabilities and just everyone in general.
Right. Being able to find the information they need quickly. One topic that comes up a lot is, people accessing a website and getting frustrated and leaving. So that's one thing, that may get people to think about this a little bit more and incorporate it, because if your users are going to just get frustrated and leave, you're missing out on a huge chunk of people that could potentially be interacting with your website that just don't have the time or the patience, or maybe they do have the patience. One of our colleagues was saying how he'll usually give a website about 30 minutes. I think your average user would probably give a website 30 seconds, but he's got the patience of Job. He'll wait 30 minutes before he gives up and washes his hands. So it's really important. I think predictable is the main thing, John. If you want to be understandable, your interface has to be predictable.
Yeah,
I think something that we talked about a little bit before, but maybe is and not easy. Nothing's easy, right? But a way that sites could potentially address some issues, and Allison in the chat mentioned this, is the whole idea of color contrast. And especially, I don't know, John, if that's less with screen readers and more with magnification. But what are some of the challenges there? And then Kim, when you test for color contrast issues, what do you do with that to make sure that that works for folks who are using adaptive technologies?
Yeah, so with the screen reader, the color contrast doesn't have anything to do with it. But when I was using my vision before, right, to be able to look, that color contrast is huge. And Kim will be able to tell you stories and stories, because that's a significant portion of our testing process.
Yeah, and it's the easiest thing, the automated checkers flag, because it's in the code, whether or not the two color combinations work. I have some colleagues that are color deficient and they have a hard time seeing certain colors. And it's really interesting to me, as long as you're compliant, then it's easy to read, but there are different combinations. So for this one particular individual, red on white is easier to see than a really dark purple on white for some reason. So there's, people they think about the pretty colors and stuff, but they don't think about, is this going to be easy to read? How much difficulty are people having? And it would be the same as coding your entire website in really tiny font. There'd only be a small amount of people that would stick around long enough to read through it.
Yeah. But there's also just a discipline. This kind of goes back to one of your comments, Kim, about the branding guidelines that people have. Like, our colors, we have to change our whole colors.
That's not the case.
That's not the case. You just have to find the discipline to say, look, this combination, this color on this color, gives us that minimum guidelines. But then, that's what you have to go with. It's just making sure you don't, you use your colors in the right discipline. And and I think that majority of people who have a visual impairment, again, I don't have the stats on me, but there's only a portion that are total blind. more people are low vision than totally blind. So making sure that, and we talk about the silver tsunami, there's 10,000 people every day who are turning 65 or older. And every 7 years they're gaining a disability, and a lot of them are visual focused. That's where this color contrast is so critical, and it can be adjusted within the code. So that's something that should be adjusted.
And Karen mentions my favorite, the pale gray. And then all the times that we see gray on gray text, it's like, no, don't use gray. Or if you do, it has to be a nice dark one.
Exactly. And then you could even use the border sometimes in this contrast to have that contrast around it. And it's just simple things that could, adjust it. But, if you look at even the Abler colors, we really, everything, all of our color combinations, what we do, we have some beautiful colors, and then they are also accessible.
Yep. Yeah, so I tell a lot of people it's good to be creative when it comes to that. So we don't absolutely have to change colors, but maybe we have to think differently about how we use those colors.
That's great.
Yep. Well, it looks like we're technically at time. Allison, the moderator, has made the point that we're allowed to keep talking if we want to. I don't know if there are more. It seems to happen with this kind of panel. If there is a little bit more data that we want to share, I've also put in the chat a link to our co-branded booth. We have folks over there right now if you want to join that. But John and Kim, anything from your perspective that, if a developer or if somebody in a web decision-making position would take away from this in terms of both compassion, empathy, but then also, why this is important, what would you leave them with?
My initial thought is talk to someone who has a disability. Spend time. I talk about proximity builds empathy, and I think that's what we're trying to do when we show our user videos. It's like you get to see, Shannon or Angus or whoever it is doing it. They introduce themselves and they say, "This is who I am. This is what I'm using," and you get to really see that. But when you can have a conversation and just talk to someone and be able to experience what they're going through, that's a whole nother, that's a whole different level of empathy. And when you're designing and, bring people in at the design phase as earlier you can, shift left and get people in as soon as possible to be part of the planning process.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that, John, those are my favorite points. But the last thing is, if you're feeling overwhelmed, just start small, but start somewhere.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Just once the ball starts rolling, so many of our clients will say, "I'll never look at a website the same," and I've learned so much. It's really eye-opening once you start down the path. So I say just start in whatever fashion you can at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And and people who are just starting off their career in development, the earlier you learn about it and you spend some time and get to see it, I think it'll stick with you throughout your career as well.
Yeah, I know that it's certainly something that our designers and developers who've been on this journey for a long time now definitely consider over, ad nauseum when we're discussing with clients, and we're always advocates for that. And it's because we've learned that this is the best for everybody. Like you said, it's, being able to visit the site through the perspective of folks who have different experiences than us. It helps make the site better for all. So
yeah, and one thing, Dave, is that sometimes people think, oh, I can just turn on VoiceOver on my computer, or just put on NVDA and I'll go through it. But if you're not a native user, and Kim could talk about it, sometimes it's like, is it a accessibility issue or is it a user issue that because there's a muscle memory that you get from using the screen reader, but it can be developed over time. But if you just think that you can get by with just turning on without having any experience using it, I think that can also cause more issues.
Yeah, and even with experience, I still call on our actual native screen reader users all the time, at least multiple times a day, because my eyes will trick into thinking that it makes more sense than it does.
Yeah, I think, John, something you mentioned to me, the problem you can run into just, essentially picking a person with a visual disability off the proverbial street is they might not be a native screen reader user. And you put them in front of a screen reader and ask them to do tasks and ask them if they have any problems, and they might be too embarrassed to admit that they don't actually know how to use a screen reader, and then say, "Oh, sure, no problem. It was great."
That's correct. That's right. Because we see that too often, and because there's an embarrassment by people to say, "I can't do something," and you're right that that's why having actual people who go through and do this on a daily basis, and the more you can get people, and this is not trying to sell our service, but it's really getting people like our team. And there's more organizations like us, but getting people like us helping out.
I think the amazing part is literally the team, how you pair up someone with a visual disability with someone without, because neither one of them can do the testing by themselves.
That's
I know
right.
when we talked early on, when you were trying to do it with an all disabled team, and it would work fine if the site was maybe 95% right, but if it's 10% right, your testers couldn't even see. Well, I say see. They couldn't. They didn't even know what they didn't know.
Okay. Yeah, we couldn't test what we didn't know was there, right? Yeah.
It was just too broken. So, so it's not even just having, a visual disabled person who is proficient with a screen reader, but you need to team them up with someone who knows how to give them the directions that they need to be able to test effectively.
Yeah. And Kim, your thoughts on this is like, you really need to have both. You need to have automated testing. You need to have manual testing if you truly want to be WCAG.
That's right. Yeah. So. Yeah, the automated actually is a great start, but it does miss quite a bit, and it only can read the code. So if it's outside of the code, my favorite example is if you have an image and it has an alternative text of the image file, that'll pass an accessibility test. But when the screen reader gets to it, this image is called 60753 image.jpg. It's compliant. It passes the accessibility checks.
Or it says placeholder text. Remember to replace this before production.
Hey, that would be better. That would be better than the file name. I would like to hear that one better. At least I know they were thinking of it at one point.
So just to sort of wrap this up, I know the workflow that we like to do is, our designers and developers are proficient with accessibility testing, but when we think we've got it right, we then would send it off to a team like Abler's just to confirm, and they'll always catch something that we don't get, but also then, if nothing else, they're confirming that we're doing everything correctly.
That's right.
Yeah, when we redesigned our Design Hammer site, we sent over some of the key templates to them, and there were things that, like I said, we've done this for years. Our key themer and site builder, Frank, knows accessibility, left and right in terms of how to test in Drupal, and there were all sorts of remediations that came back that we were like, oh, okay. A lot of that color contrast, a lot of that, things where you then have to make a tough decision of, are you going to sacrifice form and functionality for a sighted user, or are you going to work on inclusion for all? And I think, that's where we need to be, is having those discussions and ultimately understanding, like John's mentioned, that makes the site experience better for everybody.
I mean, more importantly, it was sort of helping us get past the accessibility, compliance, and meeting WCAG to actually making a usable system that, yeah, sure, this passes a tester, and technically it does pass WCAG, but it's frustrating for a screen reader user to actually use. And this is what the recommendation is, to make a better experience for a screen reader user. And that's what you're going to the experts for. Because no matter what, I'm always frustrated when I try to use a screen reader, but I don't have the right base level to understand that, yeah, I'm frustrated, but John knows this is the best it's going to get. So, you don't have to keep trying.
I think my first experience, I worked with, like John said, with Mike May, and he would say, any access is better than none. So, you make do with what's available, but there are ways to make websites, easier to use than others.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining the chat. We appreciate it, you guys contributing today, panel.
Thank you.
Attendees, thank you guys for sitting in with us for almost an hour here. We do have a full team of folks over at the booth that's in the chat, so feel free to stop by and say hi. Have access to some of the materials we have and just carry on the conversation.
Thank you,
Thank
Dave.
you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.